I stared blindly at the positive pregnancy test in my 4 daughters' bathroom, my mind racing through 1,000 terrible scenarios as the little plus sign seemed to burn itself into my retinas, mocking me with its cheerful pink color that signaled anything but a cheerful situation in a household full of teenage girls. My heart hammered in my chest as I tried to process what I was seeing, my knuckles turning white as I gripped the plastic stick like it was evidence in a crime scene, which, depending on which daughter this belonged to, it very well might be. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, snagged the test with a grip that could have crushed diamonds, and marched out to the living room where my daughters were chatting and laughing like they didn't have a care in the world, completely oblivious to the bomb I was about to drop right in the middle of their casual Saturday afternoon. Red in the face, feeling the heat rising from my collar all the way to my hairline, my voice coming out louder and more aggressive than I'd intended, I screamed, "Which one of you is pregnant?" The words seemed to echo in the suddenly silent room, hanging in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Betty, the oldest daughter at 18 and usually the most composed of the bunch, dropped her cup of juice onto the carpet in what seemed like slow motion, the liquid splashing across the beige fibers in a spreading stain that would definitely need cleaning later, but that was the least of my worries right now. "What?" she screeched, her voice hitting a pitch I didn't know she was capable of, her eyes going wide as saucers as she stared at me like I'd just announced the apocalypse. Amy, the second oldest at 17 and typically the most graceful of my girls, somehow managed to trip over absolutely nothing but air itself, her long legs tangling as she stumbled backward, her hair flipping back dramatically as she caught herself on the arm of the couch and yelled, "Who's pregnant?" with a mixture of shock and what I could only describe as morbid curiosity. Freya, the third daughter at 15 and usually the sarcastic one, just stared at nothing in particular as her mouth gaped open like a fish out of water, her face going through several shades of pale before she finally found her voice and mutters to herself in utter disbelief, "What the frick?" The word choice told me she was genuinely rattled since she usually had much more colorful vocabulary when she thought I wasn't listening. Tina, the youngest daughter at 14, and apparently the only one treating this like the entertainment event of the year, casually popped another piece of popcorn in her mouth with all the nonchalance of someone watching a reality TV show, clearly enjoying the chaos unfolding before her. "This is better than live TV," she mumbled around her mouthful of popcorn, and I felt my eyes twitch in annoyance at her complete lack of concern for the crisis at hand. I waved the positive pregnancy test aggressively in the air, shaking it like I was trying to flag down a rescue helicopter, my voice dropping to a dangerous growl as I enunciated each word with deliberate precision. "Who is pregnant?" Tina, still maintaining her role as the household's comedic relief, even in the midst of what I considered a family emergency, answered with a mouthful of popcorn that made her words slightly muffled but no less shocking. "Don't look at me. I've barely gotten to first base." I looked at Tina, feeling a whole new wave of parental anxiety wash over me as I rubbed my forehead with my free hand, already feeling a stress headache forming behind my eyes, and managed to say through gritted teeth, "Remind me to have a talk with you later about what is and isn't appropriate to share with your father." Tina just shrugged at my words with the kind of casual indifference that only a 14-year-old could muster, apparently completely unbothered by the fact that she'd just admitted to doing anything remotely romantic while still in middle school. Amy, still sprawled on the floor where she'd landed after her graceless stumble, muttered something under her breath that I couldn't quite catch, her face turning a shade of red that rivaled a ripe tomato as she stared determinedly at the carpet like it held the secrets of the universe. "What was that?" I growled, my suspicion now focusing on Amy like a spotlight, my protective father instincts going into overdrive. My stance broadened as I planted my feet firmly on the ground, crossing my arms over my chest while still clutching the pregnancy test, waiting for the verdict like a judge waiting for a jury's decision. "I like girls, Dad!" Amy all but shouted, the words tumbling out of her mouth in a rush like she'd been holding them in for years, and they'd finally broken free, her voice cracking slightly with emotion and embarrassment. Tina, Freya, Betty, and I all stared at Amy for a long, stretched-out moment where you could have heard a pin drop in the living room, the silence so thick you could cut it with a knife. Tina, never one to let a moment of silence go without commentary, tilted her head thoughtfully like she was genuinely pondering the mysteries of the universe, and asked with innocent curiosity, "So girls kiss better than guys?" I shook my head vigorously at Tina's words, feeling like I was losing control of this entire conversation, which had veered wildly off course from my original interrogation. "At least with you, Amy, I don't have to worry about underage pregnancy," I said, trying to find some silver lining in this absolute circus of a revelation, then turned to address Tina's question with the patience of a saint. "And Tina, it's about preference, not because girls kiss better or guys kiss better. It's just what feels right for each person." "Dad!" Amy practically wailed as she covered her face with both hands, her whole body curling in on itself in mortification, while Tina nodded thoughtfully at my impromptu lesson in sexual orientation like she was taking mental notes for future reference. Betty, who had been quietly observing this whole disaster unfold while trying to blot up the juice stain with some napkins, looked up at me with her big innocent eyes and said in her sweetest voice, "I haven't done the tango yet, Daddy." using the euphemism we'd established when she was 12, and I'd given her the most awkward talk of my life. I looked at Betty, really looked at her, seeing my little girl who apparently hadn't grown up quite as fast as I'd feared, and felt a rush of relief flood through me. I am suddenly very proud of being an overprotective father, I muttered under my breath, allowing myself exactly 2 seconds of satisfaction before reality crashed back down, and I remembered why we were having this conversation in the first place. I turned to Freya, my third daughter, who was suddenly looking very guilty and very nervous, her eyes darting around like she was looking for an escape route. "Do you have anything to say for yourself, young lady?" I asked, my voice taking on that particular tone that every parent masters, the one that says, "I already know you're guilty, but I'm giving you one chance to come clean." As I tapped my foot impatiently against the hardwood floor, the rhythmic sound filling the tense silence. "I'm not dumb, Dad," Freya rebuttals, her chin coming up defensively as she crossed her arms over her chest in a mirror of my own posture. "I am on the shot. My boyfriends or ex-boyfriends all wear willy wrappers, and I keep Plan B just in case, so there's like 3 layers of protection happening here." I stared blankly at Freya, my brain short-circuiting as I processed the fact that my 15-year-old daughter was apparently more sexually active than I'd ever wanted to know about, and the protective measures she'd listed off like she was reading a grocery list made my blood pressure spike. "You are grounded until you move out," I stated flatly, my voice deadly calm in that way that meant I was actually furious beyond the point of yelling. "What? Dad, that's not fair at all!" Freya protested, her voice rising in indignation as she threw her hands up in exasperation. "Plus, I am being smart about it. Way smarter than someone else in this household, apparently," she added, gesturing vaguely at the pregnancy test still clutched in my hand, like it was Exhibit A in her defense. "Yet I suspect you the most out of everyone here," I said, stepping closer to Freya with the pregnancy test held out like an accusatory finger. "Or are you telling me that this isn't your pregnancy test, that you weren't using it to know if you should take Plan B?" Amy, who had finally managed to get up off the floor and compose herself somewhat, moved over to where Tina was still lounging on the couch like she was watching the season finale of her favorite show, reached over and took a handful of popcorn from the bowl Tina was hoarding, and reiterates Tina's earlier words with even more enthusiasm. "This is definitely way better than live TV, like Emmy award-worthy drama happening right here in our living room." Tina, never taking her eyes off the showdown between Freya and myself, her head swiveling back and forth like she was watching a tennis match, states with absolute certainty, "I know, right? This is incredible." I could see Betty out of the corner of my eye, shaking her head in a mixture of disappointment and disbelief as she continued to clean up her spilled juice mess, probably wishing she was anywhere else but here witnessing this family meltdown. "Just tell me the dang truth!" I roared at Freya in complete frustration, feeling like I was losing my mind as my daughter continued to deny what seemed like obvious evidence. "I am telling you the truth, but you're not seeing it. You're not listening to me." Freya snapped right back at me, her own frustration matching mine as her voice cracked slightly with emotion. My hands clenched even tighter around the pregnancy test, my knuckles going white as I fought to keep my temper in check. "I do not accept liars in my household, young lady, and I've always taught you that honesty is the most important thing," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow seemed louder than my earlier shouting. "You don't think I know that, Dad? Don't you think I know that?" Freya's voice rose as she pleaded with me, her eyes getting watery as the stress of the situation finally seemed to be getting to her. "I am telling you the dang truth. Why won't you believe me?" "Prove it then," I said with a deadly tone that left no room for argument, crossing my arms and waiting for her response. Freya looked at me nervously, her earlier bravado crumbling as she swallowed hard, and asked in a much smaller voice, How am I supposed to prove it?" "Take a pregnancy test right now," I stated simply, like it was the most obvious solution in the world. "Do we even have another pregnancy test?" Freya asked, sounding genuinely confused as she looked around like one might materialize out of thin air. "I will go to the store right now and buy one. Yes or no? Are you willing to take it?" I stood my ground, not budging an inch as I waited for her answer. Freya just threw her hands up in defeat, probably realizing there was no way out of this situation. "Fine, whatever. Go buy the test and I'll take it. But you're going to feel really stupid when it comes back negative." And she moved past me to grab some juice from the kitchen, her shoulders slumped in resignation. The checkout line at the store felt like a walk of shame as everyone in line gave me weird looks, their eyes dropping to the single pregnancy test in my hands and then back up to my face with expressions ranging from curiosity to pity to judgment. The teenage cashier, who couldn't have been much older than Betty, rang up the pregnancy test with a knowing smile and said cheerfully, "Congratulations, man." I paid quickly, practically throwing the money at him, and stated flatly with absolutely no emotion in my voice, "It's for my underage daughter," watching with grim satisfaction as his smile disappeared and his face went pale before I turned and walked out of the store, leaving him to contemplate that uncomfortable information. Back at the house, I passed the bag to Freya without a word, noting with a mixture of annoyance and amusement that Betty, Tina, and Amy had all arranged themselves on the couch in a row like they were settling in for a movie marathon, complete with what appeared to be a fresh bowl of popcorn that they were passing between them. I could hear my 3 daughters placing bets in stage whispers on whether Freya's pregnancy test would come up positive or negative, with Tina putting her money on negative, Amy saying positive, and Betty refusing to bet on principle but still watching with rapt attention. Freya walked back into the living room a few minutes later with the test in hand, her face unreadable as she set it carefully on the coffee table. "You have to wait 7 minutes for an accurate result," Freya stated matter-of-factly, like she was reading instructions from a manual. "I have done this with your mother a handful of times over the years. I know how pregnancy tests work," I snarked with a slight bite in my tone. The memories of waiting for results when we were trying for each of our daughters flooding back. Freya just rolled her eyes in that particularly teenage way that suggested I was being ridiculous, and took a seat with her sisters on the couch, the 4 of them now united in their vigil over the test. "I am way too young to be a grandfather," I thought pitifully during the first minute, my mind already racing ahead to worst-case scenarios of helping raise a grandchild while still raising my own children. The second minute had me pacing around the living room like a caged animal, unable to sit still as nervous energy coursed through my veins, and I could feel my daughter's eyes following my back-and-forth path across the carpet. The third minute had me tapping my foot incessantly, the rhythmic sound probably driving everyone crazy, but I couldn't seem to stop. My whole body wound tight with tension. The fourth minute had me glaring at the test sitting innocuously on the coffee table, silently cursing it for taking so long to deliver its verdict, as if my anger could somehow speed up the chemical reaction happening on those little strips. The fifth minute seemed to drag each individual second on endlessly as I kept running my hand through my short hair over and over until it was probably standing up in every direction, making me look as crazy as I felt. The sixth minute had me freezing mid-pace as a sound from outside broke through my anxiety-induced tunnel vision. "Will any of you help me with the groceries?" My wife and mother to our daughters called out from the driveway, her voice carrying through the open window, completely unaware of the drama that had been unfolding in her absence. Betty, Freya, Tina, Amy, and myself all jumped up simultaneously like we'd been shocked, grateful for the distraction and the excuse to do something, anything, other than stare at that damn test for another minute. We all rushed outside and grabbed bags, carrying them into the kitchen in a flurry of activity that was probably more chaotic than helpful. And for a few blessed minutes, I completely forgot about the pregnancy test and the interrogation and the whole insane afternoon. Then my wife, setting down a bag of produce on the kitchen counter, saw at the original pregnancy test that had started this whole mess, still sitting where I'd left it on the bathroom counter, visible through the open door. "Huh?" she said casually, like she was commenting on the weather. "Guess you found my positive pregnancy test." I gasped at my wife, my mouth falling open as my brain finally connected the dots that should have been obvious from the start, the pieces clicking into place with almost audible clarity. My wife was pregnant. That's whose test it was, not one of my daughters. Then, like a bolt of lightning, I looked at the pregnancy test on the counter that was technically Freya's, the one we'd been waiting on for the past 7 minutes, and my eyes widened in horror as I realized what I was about to see. "You're both pregnant?" I shouted, my voice cracking as the words exploded out of me, unable to process this double revelation. Freya's eyes rolled back in her head as she fainted dead away, crumpling to the kitchen floor in a heap that would have been comical if I wasn't having a complete meltdown. My wife gasped and rushed toward our unconscious daughter, while simultaneously looking at me with complete confusion about why I thought she was pregnant too, and I just stood there in the middle of the kitchen, frozen in place, my brain completely overloaded and unable to form coherent thoughts. Tina, Amy, and Betty, still standing in the doorway with grocery bags in their hands, spoke as one in perfect unison like they'd rehearsed it. Definitely better than live TV. And all I could smell was popcorn. Update. Freya's eyelids fluttered open slowly as she lay sprawled on the cold kitchen tile, her head turning from side to side as she tried to figure out why everyone was hovering over her in a tight circle. Her mother knelt beside her with one hand on her forehead, checking for fever, and the other hand gripping her wrist to feel her pulse, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who dealt with plenty of childhood injuries over the years. I stood frozen a few feet away, still clutching both pregnancy tests in my hands, like some kind of deranged prosecutor presenting evidence. My face cycling rapidly between relief that my daughter was conscious and breathing, and renewed panic about the absolute disaster I'd created. Freya blinked up at all of us with genuine confusion written across her features as she asked in a weak voice what happened, and I watched her try to push herself up on her elbows, only to have her mother gently press her back down. My wife's head snapped up from examining Freya to stare at me with an expression I'd only seen a handful of times in our marriage, the kind of look that made me want to shrink into the floor and disappear completely. She demanded in a voice that cut through the kitchen like a knife exactly why everyone was acting completely insane, and why her husband was screaming about pregnancies and waving around tests like a lunatic, and I could hear that particular tone that meant she was absolutely done with everyone's nonsense and wanted answers immediately. I opened my mouth to explain about finding the first test in the bathroom and how I'd interrogated all the daughters, and made Freya take another test, but as the words started coming out, I realized halfway through my explanation just how utterly ridiculous the whole thing sounded when said out loud. My voice got quieter with each word, as the full weight of my overreaction crashed down on me, and I trailed off completely when I saw my wife's expression shift from confusion to disbelief to barely contained anger. She stood up from where she'd been kneeling beside Freya and walked over to the kitchen counter where Freya's test sat, picking it up with 2 fingers like it was contaminated evidence. Her eyes scanned the little window on the test for exactly 2 seconds before she turned back to face me with an expression that could have frozen molten lava in its tracks. She stated flatly, without a single ounce of warmth in her voice, that I had traumatized our 15-year-old daughter and made her faint over absolutely nothing, holding up the test so I could see the single line that clearly indicated a negative result. My stomach dropped somewhere around my feet as I stared at that negative test, realizing I'd put Freya through this entire nightmare for no reason whatsoever. My wife continued explaining in that same flat, dangerous tone that her own positive test had been sitting on the bathroom counter, because she'd literally just taken it that morning and had been planning to tell me the news over a nice romantic dinner that evening, not during some kind of family interrogation where I accused our daughters of teenage pregnancy. I felt my face burning with shame as the full scope of my mistake became crystal clear, and I couldn't even look at Freya, who was still lying on the floor looking dazed and confused about why she'd passed out in the first place. Betty finally stopped her attempts to clean up the juice stain that had been forgotten in all the chaos and looked up at our mother with cautious hope in her eyes as she asked if Mom was really actually pregnant. My wife's expression softened immediately as she looked at Betty and confirmed it with a genuine smile spreading across her face. And that's when all 4 of our daughters erupted into the kind of excited screaming that made my earlier panic look calm and quiet by comparison. Tina dropped her popcorn bowl, which scattered kernels across the already messy kitchen floor as she jumped up and down. Amy started crying what were clearly happy tears as she covered her mouth with both hands. Freya tried to sit up too fast and immediately got dizzy again, requiring her mother to steady her, and Betty actually crossed the kitchen to hug me, despite being visibly annoyed at how I'd handled the entire situation. The kitchen transformed into absolute chaos as all 4 girls talked over each other, asking questions about due dates and baby names and whether they'd have a brother or sister, and I just stood there feeling like the world's biggest idiot for causing all this drama. I cleared my throat loudly to get everyone's attention, and when they finally quieted down, I looked directly at Freya and apologized to everyone, but especially to her, admitting out loud that I had completely overreacted and should have asked calm questions before making wild accusations and waving pregnancy tests around like some kind of crazy person. Freya looked at me for a long moment before she accepted my apology with a small nod. But then she pointed out in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear that according to my earlier declaration, she was still grounded until she moved out of the house. The whole family turned to stare at me expectantly, waiting to see if I would actually try to enforce that absolutely ridiculous punishment I'd handed down in my panic, and I could feel the weight of their collective judgment pressing down on me. I rubbed the back of my neck and admitted that maybe grounding her until she moved out was a bit extreme, and we'd need to talk about appropriate consequences later when everyone had calmed down. The tension in the kitchen broke slightly as my wife suggested we all needed to eat something and process everything that had happened, so I pulled out my phone and ordered 3 large pizzas while the girls helped their mother get Freya off the floor and onto a chair. Later that evening, after everyone had calmed down somewhat and the pizzas had arrived, I called a proper family meeting at the dining table because we clearly needed to actually talk about everything that had exploded out during my panic attack. The atmosphere felt tense, but also oddly lighter than before as we all took our seats around the table with paper plates and pizza slices, and Tina immediately broke the tension by joking that she needed more popcorn for this family meeting since it was bound to be entertaining. Amy sat there nervously picking at her pizza crust without actually eating any of it, her eyes darting around the table like she was working up the courage to say something important. She took a deep breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest and addressed her coming out properly this time, instead of just blurting it out during my interrogation, explaining that she'd known she liked girls for about 2 years, but had been absolutely terrified to tell anyone in the family. Her voice cracked slightly as she said the chaos earlier had just made everything burst out of her before she was ready, and I could see tears forming in the corners of her eyes. I reached across the table to hold her hand in mine and told her as clearly as I could that I loved her no matter what, that my only real concern was her happiness and safety, and that I was genuinely sorry my pregnancy freak-out had overshadowed what should have been her important moment. Amy squeezed my hand back and wiped at her eyes with her free hand, and I noticed my wife reaching over to rub Amy's back in small, comforting circles. The conversation shifted naturally to Freya next, and instead of yelling or making accusations like I had earlier, I asked her in the calmest voice I could manage to help me understand why she was sexually active at 15 and what had made her decide to take all those safety precautions. Freya looked surprised that I was actually asking instead of just laying down the law, and she explained carefully that she wasn't trying to rebel against us or hurt anyone. She just wanted to make her own choices about her body and her relationships. She told us she'd researched everything carefully online and talked to the school nurse because she understood completely what the consequences would be of not being careful and responsible. I listened to her whole explanation without interrupting, even though every protective father instinct in my body wanted to lock her in her room until she was 30. And when she finished, I admitted out loud that I was absolutely terrified of watching my daughters grow up and make adult choices. I told Freya that I recognized she was actually being more responsible than a lot of adults I knew, and that maybe my fear had made me react badly and jump to the worst possible conclusions. We negotiated new terms right there at the dining table, where her grounding would be reduced to just 2 weeks with no phone privileges. And in exchange, she agreed to monthly check-ins with me about her safety and choices, without any judgment from my side. Freya seemed relieved by the compromise, and actually thanked me for being willing to listen and trust her, which made my chest feel tight with emotion. Tina's first base comment got addressed next, because I couldn't just let that slide, even though part of me wanted to ignore it completely. And I tried to have an age-appropriate conversation about relationships and boundaries without losing my mind again like I had earlier. Tina admitted pretty quickly that she'd exaggerated quite a bit for dramatic effect, because the boy she liked had really only held her hand twice at the school, and that was the full extent of their romance. I visibly relaxed at that confession, and explained to her as calmly as possible that at 14, hand-holding and maybe a quick kiss were appropriate, but anything beyond that really needed to wait several more years until she was older and more mature. My wife set down her pizza slice and cleared her throat to get everyone's attention, then explained she was about 8 weeks along, and the baby would be due sometime in late spring, probably around May, if everything went according to schedule. She rubbed her stomach in that automatic way pregnant women do, and admitted she was already feeling tired all the time. And with 4 teenagers in the house plus a full-time job, she was going to need everyone to step up and help out more than usual. Betty jumped in before anyone else could speak, and volunteered to take over more of the cooking duties since she was already pretty good at it, and enjoyed trying new recipes anyway. Amy offered to handle all the laundry for the family, saying she could easily throw in loads between homework sessions, and it wasn't that hard to keep track of. Freya surprised me by saying she'd manage the grocery shopping each week, explaining she could take the car on Saturdays and get everything we needed from the list Mom would make. Tina promised to keep everyone entertained so Mom wouldn't get stressed out, which made everyone laugh because Tina was already the household entertainment, whether we wanted it or not. My wife's eyes got a little watery as she looked around the table at our daughters, all volunteering without being asked, and she reached out to squeeze my hand under the table. The rest of the evening passed quietly as we finished the pizza and cleaned up together, everyone moving around the kitchen in a comfortable rhythm that felt different from earlier, less tense and more united somehow. That night, after the girls had all gone to their rooms and my wife was already asleep beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and replaying the entire day in my head like a horrible movie I couldn't turn off. I kept thinking about how badly I'd handled everything with Freya, how I'd accused her and made her prove her innocence like she was guilty until proven otherwise instead of trusting her word. The look on her face when I demanded she take that test kept flashing through my mind, the hurt and betrayal in her eyes when she realized I didn't believe her. I'd nearly damaged my relationship with my daughter over my own fear and wild assumptions, and if my wife hadn't come home when she did with her own pregnancy news, I might have pushed Freya even further away. I thought about the new baby growing inside my wife right now, how in about 15 years that baby would be a teenager too, and I'd probably face similar situations all over again. I needed to do better at listening first and reacting second, at trusting my kids until they gave me a real reason not to, at controlling my panic instead of letting it control me. The clock on the nightstand showed 2 in the morning before I finally fell asleep, my mind still churning through all the ways I could have handled the day differently. The next morning, I woke up early and made myself a cup of coffee, then stood outside Freya's bedroom door for a solid 5 minutes trying to work up the courage to knock. I finally tapped on the door softly and asked if we could talk privately, half expecting her to tell me to go away. Instead, she called out that I could come in, so I pushed open the door and found her sitting on her bed with her laptop, probably doing homework or browsing social media. I sat down in her desk chair and looked at her directly. No pregnancy tests or accusations between us this time, just a father and daughter who needed to clear the air. I told her I was genuinely sorry for not trusting her yesterday, for making assumptions about her character and treating her like she was lying when she'd been telling me the truth the whole time. I explained that my fear had taken over my brain and made me react in the worst possible way, but that wasn't an excuse for how I'd treated her. Freya's eyes got shiny with tears as she admitted she'd been really hurt that I thought she would lie to me about something so serious, that after everything we'd talked about regarding honesty, I'd still assumed the worst. I moved from the chair to sit beside her on the bed and pulled her into a proper hug, the kind without an audience or pregnancy test drama or sisters watching from the couch. She hugged me back tight and whispered that she forgave me, and I felt some of the guilt from last night finally start to ease up in my chest. 2 weeks passed in relative calm as we all adjusted to the news of the baby and settled into our new household routine with everyone taking on their assigned tasks. One morning I was making coffee in the kitchen when Amy came downstairs earlier than usual, her hair still messy from sleep and her hands fidgeting with the hem of her pajama shirt. She stood in the doorway for a minute just watching me pour coffee grounds into the filter, clearly working up the nerve to say something. Finally, she mentioned she had a friend named Raymond, whose mom ran something called a PFLAG chapter, and maybe I'd want to go to a meeting with her to learn more about supporting her now that she'd come out. I agreed immediately without even thinking about it, even though the idea of going to a support group meeting made me feel awkward and uncomfortable. I wanted Amy to know I was serious about being supportive and not just saying empty words during a family crisis, that I was willing to put in actual effort to understand her better. Her whole face lit up with relief, and she hugged me right there in the kitchen, coffee forgotten, and told me the next meeting was on Thursday evening. Thursday came faster than I expected, and I found myself sitting in a community center room with Amy, surrounded by other parents and their kids in folding chairs arranged in a circle. A woman introduced herself as Phyllis and explained she was Raymond's mother and had been running this PFLAG chapter for about 3 years now. She shared her own story of learning to support Raymond when he came out as gay 5 years ago, how scared she'd been at first, and how she'd made mistakes but worked through them. Other parents around the circle took turns sharing their experiences, talking about their fears and their growth and the challenges they'd faced. One dad admitted he'd kicked his son out at first, but later realized what a terrible mistake that was and spent 2 years rebuilding their relationship. A mom talked about learning to correct people who used the wrong pronouns for her daughter and how empowering it felt to advocate loudly. I listened to all of them and realized my panic about Amy was completely normal, that lots of parents went through this same fear and confusion and came out the other side better for it. When Phyllis asked if I wanted to share, I talked briefly about Amy's coming out during the pregnancy test chaos and how I was still learning but committed to doing better. Amy squeezed my hand when I finished talking, and several parents nodded in understanding like they'd been through similar situations. Back at home over the next few days, my wife started experiencing morning sickness that turned out to be all-day sickness, spending hours either in bed or hovering near the bathroom. The family immediately went into support mode without anyone having to organize it or assign tasks. Betty took over making bland foods that wouldn't upset Mom's stomach, researching online which foods were safe and helpful during pregnancy nausea. Amy started looking up natural remedies and made ginger tea multiple times a day, bringing it to Mom with saltine crackers on a little tray. Freya made several trips to the store for ginger ale and different types of crackers, trying to find brands and flavors that Mom could actually keep down. Tina appointed herself as the entertainment committee and sat beside Mom's bed playing silly videos on her phone, trying to make her laugh and distract her from feeling awful. I watched my daughters taking care of their mother with such love and competence, working together like a well-oiled machine, and felt this overwhelming pride in the young women they were becoming despite my earlier panic and overreaction. They'd taken my fears and chaos from a few weeks ago and turned it into something positive, using the situation to grow closer as a family instead of letting it drive us apart. 3 weeks after the initial pregnancy test chaos, Freya came home from the school with her jaw clenched and her eyes red like she'd been crying or was trying really hard not to. She dropped her backpack on the floor with more force than necessary and announced that Nicholas, her ex-boyfriend, was spreading rumors at the school that she'd gotten pregnant and had an abortion. Apparently, he was still bitter about their breakup and had decided to make up lies to hurt her reputation. My protective instincts kicked into overdrive immediately, and I reached for my phone to call the school, ready to march down there and demand they do something about this kid spreading lies about my daughter. Freya grabbed my wrist before I could dial and asked me to let her handle it first, explaining she needed to learn to fight her own battles instead of having her dad swoop in to fix everything. I wanted to argue that this was serious and required adult intervention, but I remembered my resolution to listen first and react second, to trust my daughters more. I agreed to let Freya handle the situation herself, but made it very clear I was there as backup if she needed me, that I wouldn't hesitate to step in if things got worse or if she asked for help. The next day, I drove her to the school but stayed in the car, watching through the window as she walked up to Nicholas in the parking lot, with several of her friends flanking her like bodyguards. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I could see her standing tall and speaking calmly, while Nicholas shifted uncomfortably and looked around like he was searching for an escape route. She pulled out her phone and showed him something on the screen, probably proof that his lies were false, and he went pale before nodding and walking away quickly. Freya turned and gave me a thumbs up through the car window, and I felt this surge of pride watching her handle herself with such maturity and confidence. I'd learned an important lesson about protecting my daughters, that sometimes the best protection was teaching them to protect themselves and then trusting them to do it. A few nights later, I was heading to bed around 11 when I noticed light coming from under Tina's door and heard the quiet sound of her giggling. I knocked and pushed open the door to find her lying in bed with her phone, clearly texting someone despite it being way past when she should be asleep on a school night. My anxiety started to resurface briefly as I thought about the boy she'd mentioned weeks ago, but this time I sat down calmly on the edge of her bed instead of jumping to worst-case scenarios. I asked who she was texting, and she admitted it was the boy from her class, and they'd been talking every night for the past week. Instead of freaking out or taking her phone away immediately, I explained that texting late at night wasn't healthy because she needed proper sleep for school, and also that constant communication with a boy at 14 could become too intense too fast. Tina actually listened without arguing and said she understood, agreeing to keep her phone in the kitchen after 9 p.m. on the school nights so she wouldn't be tempted to stay up texting. She thanked me for not yelling at her like I had during the pregnancy test incident, and I realized how much calmer and more effective this approach was compared to my earlier panic. At my wife's 12-week ultrasound appointment, the whole family crowded into the small exam room to see the baby on screen, all 5 of us plus my wife on the table making the space feel cramped and warm. The technician squeezed cold gel onto my wife's stomach and moved the wand around until a grainy image appeared on the monitor, showing a tiny baby shape with a visible heartbeat flickering on screen. All 4 daughters started crying happy tears at the same time, and I felt my own eyes getting watery as I watched my future son or daughter moving around on that screen. The technician asked if we wanted to know the baby's gender at the 20-week scan coming up in 2 months, which sparked an immediate debate among the family. Betty and Amy voted for finding out because they wanted to start planning and buying gender-specific items. Freya and Tina wanted to be surprised because they thought it would be more exciting to wait until the birth. My wife and I decided we'd let the girls vote again closer to the actual appointment, giving everyone time to think about it more seriously, and the technician laughed and said she'd seen plenty of families go through this same discussion. We left the appointment with ultrasound pictures that Tina immediately claimed for her room, and I drove home thinking about how far we'd come as a family in just 3 months. About 2 weeks after that ultrasound appointment, Amy cornered me in the garage while I was taking out the trash and asked in this really nervous voice if she could maybe invite her girlfriend over for dinner sometime soon. She explained that she'd been dating someone named Abigail for about a month now and really wanted us to meet her properly instead of just hearing about her in passing. I felt this weird mix of excitement that Amy trusted me enough to want to introduce her girlfriend, and also complete terror that I'd somehow mess it up and embarrass my daughter in front of someone she clearly cared about. I agreed immediately, though, maybe a little too enthusiastically based on the way Amy's eyes got wide, and told her to pick a night that worked, and we'd make it happen. She hugged me right there next to the garbage cans and whispered thanks before running back inside to text Abigail the good news. My wife found me still standing in the garage a few minutes later and asked what had me looking so dazed. So I explained about the dinner invitation and watched her face light up with the same excited nervousness I was feeling. She pulled out her phone right there and started looking up recipes that would be impressive but not too fancy, muttering about wanting to make a good first impression without seeming like we were trying too hard. The next few days leading up to Friday night were honestly kind of hilarious, watching Amy stress clean her room like the girlfriend was going to be inspecting it with white gloves. She reorganized her bookshelf 3 times, changed her sheets twice, and I caught her practicing conversation topics in the mirror, which she absolutely denied when I knocked on her door. Friday evening arrived faster than I was ready for, and I found myself changing my shirt 4 times before my wife told me to stop being ridiculous and just wear the blue one. The doorbell rang at exactly 6:30, and Amy practically flew down the stairs to answer it, her face flushed with nerves and excitement. Abigail turned out to be this tall girl with short dark hair and a really genuine smile, and she shook my hand firmly while making direct eye contact, which I appreciated. My wife ushered everyone into the dining room where she'd set the table with our nice dishes and lit candles that made everything look warm and welcoming. I made the mistake of launching into this prepared speech about how our family supports love in all forms, and everyone is welcome here, which came out way more intense than I'd intended based on the way Abigail's eyes went wide. Amy looked like she wanted to sink through the floor, and my wife kicked me under the table hard enough to make me yelp and cut the speech short. But Abigail just laughed and said she appreciated the enthusiasm, even if it was a little overwhelming, which broke the tension immediately and made everyone relax. Dinner actually went really well once I stopped trying so hard, with Abigail telling funny stories about her college classes and asking genuine questions about each of my daughter's interests and hobbies. She was studying psychology at the local university and had this way of making everyone feel heard when they talked that reminded me a lot of my wife's calm presence. Tina waited until we were halfway through the main course before launching into what I can only describe as an interrogation, asking Abigail about her intentions toward Amy and whether she was serious about the relationship or just messing around. The whole table went quiet for a second before Abigail answered completely seriously that she really cared about Amy and wasn't the type to play games with people's feelings. Tina nodded like she was satisfied with that answer and went back to eating her chicken, and everyone started laughing because leave it to my 14-year-old to act like a protective bodyguard. The rest of the evening flowed easily with Abigail fitting into our family dynamic like she'd been there all along, teasing Tina right back when Tina made jokes and complimenting Betty on the dessert she'd made. When Abigail left around 9, Amy walked her to the door, and I pretended not to watch them say goodbye through the living room window, though I definitely saw them kiss quickly before Abigail headed to her car. Amy came back inside with this huge smile on her face and thanked us all for being cool and not making it too weird, though I pointed out that I definitely made it a little weird with my speech. She hugged me anyway and said it meant a lot that I was trying, which made my chest feel tight with emotion. A few days later on a Tuesday afternoon, I came home from work to find Betty sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by papers and college brochures with tears streaming down her face. She looked up when I walked in and immediately tried to wipe her eyes and act like nothing was wrong, but I could see her hands shaking as she shuffled the papers around. I sat down across from her and asked what was going on. Really asked instead of just accepting her automatic response of everything being fine. Betty's face crumpled and she started crying harder, admitting that she was drowning in college applications and AP exam pressure and couldn't keep pretending she had everything under control anymore. She explained that she'd been maintaining this perfect image for so long that she didn't know how to ask for help without feeling like a failure. I felt this wave of guilt wash over me as I realized I'd been so focused on Amy's coming out and Freya's relationship drama and the new baby that I'd completely missed my oldest daughter struggling right in front of me. Betty talked about how she'd been terrified of disappointing us by not getting into the best schools or not maintaining her perfect grades, and how the pressure felt like it was crushing her from all sides. I reached across the table and took her hand, telling her that we needed to talk about this properly and figure out how to make things better instead of her carrying all this weight alone. We sat there for hours that evening, just the two of us at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to bed, talking about expectations and pressure and what really mattered in life. I admitted that I'd relied too heavily on her to be the responsible one and the good daughter, and that wasn't fair to put that kind of pressure on an 18-year-old. Betty cried harder when I said that her mental health and happiness mattered way more than any college acceptance or perfect grade, like she'd been waiting years to hear someone say that out loud. We decided together that she'd drop 2 of her AP classes next semester and switch them for regular versions, and that she'd resign from the debate team and one other club that she'd only joined because she thought it would look good on applications. She looked at me with this mixture of relief and fear, asking if I was really sure it was okay for her to do less instead of more. I promised her it was not just okay but necessary, that I'd rather have a daughter who was healthy and happy than one who was perfect, but miserable. Betty hugged me so tight I could barely breathe, and whispered that she'd been scared to tell anyone how bad it had gotten, and I held her while she cried out months of built-up stress and pressure. The next morning, I called a family meeting before anyone left for school and explained that we needed to redistribute household responsibilities because Betty had been carrying too much weight. I acknowledged out loud that I'd created an unfair situation by relying so heavily on my oldest daughter to help run the household, and that needed to change immediately. We went through all the regular chores and tasks, with everyone volunteering for specific things without me even having to assign them. Amy took over all the meal planning and grocery list making, Freya committed to doing dishes every night and keeping the kitchen clean, and Tina promised to handle all the laundry for the whole family, including folding and putting away. I took on more of the daily tasks myself too, like packing lunches and making sure everyone had what they needed for school, instead of leaving that to Betty. My wife pointed out that Betty should focus on her schoolwork and college applications, without worrying about household management, and everyone agreed immediately. Betty teared up again, but in a good way this time, thanking everyone for understanding and helping. I also made an appointment for Betty to start seeing the school counselor weekly to work on her perfectionism and anxiety, which she agreed to without argument. Within just a few days, I noticed her smiling more genuinely, laughing at Tina's jokes instead of just managing everything, and actually relaxing in the evenings instead of constantly working. She started taking walks after dinner just for fun, not because she was trying to fit in exercise between studying, and I'd catch her reading books she actually wanted to read instead of just assigned reading. The change in her was so obvious that even Tina commented on how much happier Betty seemed, and I felt grateful we'd caught it before things got even worse. 3 months after the initial pregnancy test chaos, Freya's grounding officially ended on a Saturday morning, and I asked her to come talk to me privately in my home office. She walked in looking nervous, like she thought I was going to extend the punishment or add new rules, but I just told her to sit down because I wanted to say something important. I explained that I was genuinely proud of how maturely she'd handled everything over the past few months, including the drama with Nicholas spreading rumors and her continued responsibility with birth control. Freya looked surprised, like she'd been expecting criticism instead of praise, and her eyes got a little watery when I said it. I admitted that I'd handled the initial situation badly by not trusting her word and making assumptions about her character, but that watching her prove herself over these months had taught me a lot about who she really was. She thanked me for actually listening and eventually trusting her instead of just staying mad forever, and said our relationship felt different now in a good way. I agreed that it felt stronger because we'd worked through something hard together and come out the other side with better communication and more honesty. Freya asked if she could go to a party that night with some friends, and I said yes without even hesitating, which made her eyes go wide with surprise. I added that I trusted her to make good choices and that trust was something she'd earned through consistency, not something I was just giving away. She hugged me tight and promised she wouldn't let me down, and I believed her completely. At the 20-week ultrasound appointment, the whole family piled into the exam room again, just like we had for the 12-week scan. The technician asked if we wanted to know the baby's gender this time, and all 4 daughters immediately started talking over each other about whether to find out or wait. Betty and Amy still wanted to know so they could start planning and buying specific things, while Freya and Tina wanted to be surprised at the birth. My wife suggested we take a family vote right there in the exam room, so everyone raised their hands for either finding out or waiting. The vote came out 4-2 in favor of finding out, with my wife and I breaking the tie by voting to no. The technician smiled and moved the ultrasound wand around on my wife's belly, pointing out different body parts and measurements before pausing on one specific view. She announced with a big smile that we were having a boy, and the room erupted in noise as all 4 of my daughters started crying happy tears at the same time. Betty grabbed Amy's hand and squeezed it while they both sobbed. Freya covered her mouth with both hands as tears ran down her face, and Tina just kept saying over and over that she was getting a baby brother. I felt my own eyes getting watery watching my daughters react to the news, thinking about how they'd been an all-girl household their entire lives, and now everything was about to change. My wife was crying too as she watched our daughters celebrate, and the technician handed us a whole stack of tissues while laughing at how emotional everyone was. I couldn't stop thinking about raising a son and hoping desperately that I'd do better with him than I'd initially done handling my daughter's teenage years, that I'd learned enough from my mistakes to be the father he deserved. The drive home was loud and chaotic, with all four girls talking about baby names and nursery themes, and what they'd teach their little brother, and I just listened to them plan, while feeling this huge weight of responsibility and excitement. 2 weeks after finding out about the boy, I was at work when my phone rang with my wife's number, and I answered to hear her crying and saying something was wrong. She explained through sobs that she was having sharp pains and bleeding, and was scared something was happening to the baby. I told my boss I had a family emergency, and practically ran to my car, calling my wife back to tell her I was coming home right now to take her to the hospital. When I got home, she was sitting on the couch looking pale and scared, and I helped her to the car as gently as possible, while trying not to let my own panic show on my face. I called Betty from the car and told her to stay home with her sisters, and that I'd update them as soon as I knew anything, hearing her voice crack as she promised to keep everyone calm. The drive to the hospital felt like it took forever, even though I was going way faster than I should have been, and my wife gripped my hand so tight her knuckles went white. We got to the emergency room, and they took her back immediately when I said she was 22 weeks pregnant and bleeding, leaving me to pace in the waiting area while they ran tests. I texted the girls that we were at the hospital, and the doctors were checking everything, trying to sound calmer than I felt. The waiting was absolutely horrible, with every minute feeling like an hour as I imagined worst-case scenarios and prayed harder than I'd prayed in years. Back at home, I knew my daughters were going through the same torture, probably huddled together on the couch and staring at their phones waiting for updates. I kept checking my phone every 30 seconds like that would make news come faster, and I wore a path in the waiting room carpet from pacing back and forth so many times. After what felt like forever but was probably only 2 hours, a doctor finally came out to talk to me, and I practically jumped out of my seat. The doctor explained that my wife had experienced a minor placental issue that caused the bleeding and pain, but that it had resolved itself, and the baby's heartbeat was strong and steady. He said she'd need to be on bed rest for at least 2 weeks and avoid any stress or physical activity, but that with proper rest everything should be fine. The relief that flooded through me was so intense, I actually felt dizzy and had to sit back down, and I thanked the doctor about 5 times before he even finished talking. They let me go back to see my wife, and I found her in a hospital bed looking exhausted but relieved, and we both just held hands and cried for a few minutes without saying anything. I texted the girls that everything was okay, and the baby was fine, and within seconds my phone started buzzing with responses and questions. My wife called home on speakerphone so all 4 daughters could hear her voice and know she was really okay, and I could hear them all crying with relief on the other end. The scare put everything in perspective for me in a way nothing else had, making my earlier panic about pregnancy tests seem completely ridiculous compared to the real fear of losing a child. We'd already started loving this baby so much even though he wasn't born yet, and the thought of losing him had been absolutely terrifying. My wife had to stay overnight for observation, but they said she could go home the next day if everything stayed stable. So I stayed with her in the hospital room and we talked about how grateful we were and how much we loved our family. The next afternoon, I brought my wife home to an absolutely spotless house where the girls had clearly been stress cleaning while waiting for us. They'd made up the couch with pillows and blankets so it was like a comfortable nest, and they'd stocked the coffee table with water bottles and snacks and the TV remote. My wife teared up seeing how much thought they'd put into making her comfortable, and all 4 girls carefully hugged her without squeezing too hard. Over the next 2 weeks, our family operated like the most efficient machine I'd ever seen, with everyone stepping up without being asked or reminded. Betty handled all the cooking and brought my wife meals in bed. Amy took over managing the household schedule. And making sure everyone got where they needed to be, Freya did all the cleaning and laundry without a single complaint, and Tina appointed herself as entertainment director to keep her mom from getting bored. I watched my daughters take care of their mother with such love and skill, and I realized the family crisis had actually brought us all closer together instead of tearing us apart. They worked together seamlessly, communicating about who was doing what, and helping each other without any of the usual sibling bickering. My wife commented multiple times about how proud she was of them, and I agreed completely. The growth I'd seen in each of them over the past few months was incredible. From Amy's confidence about her identity, to Freya's maturity, to Betty's willingness to ask for help, to Tina's increasing emotional awareness. The chaos that had started with me finding a pregnancy test and completely losing my mind had somehow led us to this point where we were stronger and more connected as a family than we'd ever been before. A few weeks later, when Tina came into the living room holding her phone and asked if she could go to the winter dance with the boy she'd been texting, I felt my old panic trying to surface, but managed to push it down and actually respond like a normal parent instead of a crazy person. I told her I wanted to meet him first, which she agreed to immediately. So the next afternoon, this skinny kid named Marcus showed up at our door looking absolutely scared out of his mind as I opened it and invited him inside. We sat in the living room for about 20 minutes while I asked him basic questions about school and his interests and his plans for the dance, and honestly, he seemed like a decent kid who was just as nervous about dating as Tina probably was. I set a curfew of 11 p.m. and explained that Betty would be driving them to the dance and picking them up, which Marcus nodded along to while his hands shook slightly in his lap. After he left, Tina threw her arms around me in a tight hug and whispered right in my ear that she was really glad I wasn't acting as crazy as I had during the whole pregnancy test disaster, and I couldn't help but laugh because she was absolutely right about how insane I'd been back then. The night of the dance, I watched Betty drive off with Tina and Marcus in the back seat, and my wife squeezed my hand while commenting on how much calmer I'd handled the situation compared to a few months ago. Several months later in early spring, when my wife was about 8 months pregnant and starting to waddle everywhere, the girls announced they wanted to throw a baby shower and insisted on planning the whole thing themselves without any help from us. Betty took charge of the food and made this incredible spread of finger sandwiches and fruit platters and a cake decorated with little blue booties. Amy handled all the decorations and turned our living room into this beautiful space with streamers and balloons and a banner she'd painted herself. Freya organized all the games and kept everyone entertained with baby bingo and guess the baby food flavors, and Tina appointed herself as the official photographer and ran around taking pictures of everything. I stood off to the side watching my wife sit in the middle of the couch opening gifts, while our 4 daughters buzzed around her like a well-coordinated team, each one knowing exactly what to do without anyone having to tell them. And I found myself thinking about how that crazy afternoon with the pregnancy test had actually forced us to have conversations we desperately needed, even though I'd handled it in the worst possible way. The girls had grown so much in just these few months, becoming more honest and open, and supportive of each other, and while I definitely wouldn't recommend my methods of screaming and accusations and demanding pregnancy tests, I felt grateful for where we'd ended up as a family because of it.